Good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming on this beautiful day. Let's introduce the panel. Starting on my far right, returning for the third time, rather popular young man here in the Dallas Opera, James Valenti, who's singing the role of Alfredo. Next to him, returning after too long of an absence, our conductor, Guidarini. Not only making her Dallas Opera debut, but her American stage debut. She did do a concert in New York last season. We sort of ignore that. But we're thrilled to have in this wonderful role for her, something of a signature role. She sung it to great acclaim in a number of theaters, Myrtò, Papatanasiu.
Hello.
Making his Dallas Opera debut, but not his American debut, in the role of Germont, Laurent Naouri. And a man who's been affiliated with the Dallas Opera for most of its 50-odd years, who has directed countless productions for us, Bliss, Hebert. And at the far left, another guest who has been many times with the Dallas Opera, has done many productions for us, the production designer, Alan Charles Klein. Let's get started by talking a little bit about why the piece was perhaps unsuccessful when it's initially premiered. There's a rumor that it was because it was performed in modern dress and the audiences didn't actually respond to what they thought of as a contemporary opera, but it was actually in Verdi's contract that he was going to write something with a contemporary setting, but the initial production was actually set in the 1700s, almost 100 years earlier, because they were afraid that the subject matter would be so controversial if it was done in modern dress. It is, I suppose, the major reason it was a flop was the soprano who created the role of Violetta was somewhat overweight, and the audience found it ludicrous that she was dying of consumption, which is called the wasting disease, and she hardly looked like she was wasting away. The music is really prime Verdi, and as Marco and I were talking the other day, I think it's his most personal opera. Obviously, he was attracted to the subject matter because of his personal life. The character of Violetta is so sympathetically drawn, and I suspect it has a lot to do with Verdi's relationship with the infamous Giuseppe Straponi, with whom he lived but did not marry for many years. And she had been a notorious woman. She'd been involved with numerous other men, had illegitimate children, and was the creator of the role of Abigail in Nabucco. And Verdi met her, and he was married at the time, but once his wife died, they became involved, and they lived together for many years in Verdi's hometown, and it was a scandal that the public just never forgave him for, even after they were married. But the music is so remarkable, and I'd like Marco to talk a little bit about why this piece is so poignant and successful, and why audiences respond to it so greatly.
Good afternoon to everyone. Of course, to speak about this fabulous score, having had the privilege of conducting this score several times, and as well as the main Verdis, it's a privilege in a sense to be able to deliver every time as much as, you know, it's up to our capabilities and to our talent, what in fact we presume was the insight of a composer such Verdi. What happens in this period of his life, musically speaking, is that his style, with these three very famous operas like Rigoletto and of course Trovatore, these three scores together, they happen to make a sort of a different step in his aesthetics, in terms of how actually he perceives the musical theater should be. That is, my opinion over this matter is that, in fact, the so-called trilogia popolare, popular trilogy, does mark a sort of a profound change from what is the aesthetic of the bel canto. And yet, these three operas and Traviata too, they own a lot to what the bel canto had been since until that moment. That is particularly in terms of how the structure, the vocal line, and as well the instrumentation is concerned. But I do think that with these three operas, in a way, there is a turn of a page from that aesthetic that was mainly about writing beautiful music for the vocal lines, for the vocality, and actually getting deeper into a conception that is about expressing feelings through what the music is. So in this respect, we can speak about a sort of verismo. It's not a verismo as such, not intended as could be a literary movement like in the French terms of la race, le milieu, le moment, that is, specify certain things that actually define a way of thought. It's nevertheless an attempt, a phenomenal attempt of putting the entire idea of writing for the theater in music, so that the feelings are prevalent to the beauty. Of course, these two elements, they combine. That is because, of course, the deep roots of the way of writing of Giuseppe Verdi, particularly in the vocal sense, are deep down into the late bel canto, particularly in the serious bel canto of a certain Donizetti and of a certain Rossini. But I do think that the main reason of this, if I have to name one reason of this huge success, is because the overall emotional impact that we still feel nowadays, so actually this sense, is that nobody had heard something so profoundly touching and so psychologically speaking in his own time.
When you talk about the bel canto structure, I think it's important that even though there are cuts that are frequently made in this piece that sort of alter that, but the tradition of an aria and a cabaletta is carried through from the bel canto period through Traviata. The aria A Forse Lui, followed by the cabaletta Sempre Libera, which is a slow introspective section followed by a faster change of mood, change of temperament. The same thing happens. The tenor has his aria, and then a cabaletta where he is talking about being in love, and then he sings the cabaletta, which is frequently cut, O mio rimorso, and the baritone has his aria di Provenza, and it has a cabaletta, which is almost always cut. So that structure of traditional bel canto, rigid, opening with a chorus, then having an aria, then having all of this comes back from the period of Donizetti and Rossini and that whole bel canto period. Bliss, tell us a little bit about how this production evolved. This is in a profound way connected to the history of the Dallas Opera and with your own personal history. So I think the audience would find it very interesting to talk about your first experiences here in Dallas and how this has led inexorably to this production of Traviata.
Well, I have to start off, please don't anybody ask me my age. As it happened, I was with the Dallas Opera from the beginning. I'm the only living survivor, it seems. I was here in 1958, which was the first full season of the Dallas Opera. For 57, one opera was done, and Maria Callas did a concert. In the second season, 1958, Maria Callas was here. She sang Traviata, and she sang also Medea, the famous Medea during which Bing fired her from the Metropolitan Opera. And the other opera was L'Italiana in Algeria, sung by Teresa Berganza. Well, the opera was very young and naive at that time, in spite of all of the wonderful people at the top and the great casts that they hired. I was hired, number one, as rehearsal pianist, number two, as stage assistant to both Cefarelli and Alexis Menatis, who was doing the Medea. So I got to know the artists very well because I was sort of a Figaro from Barbara Seville, doing everything, including driving them to the opera. It was, as I say, it was a very naive time. But something very serious happened. This was the time of McCarthyism, and Maestro Naldini, who was the prompter of La Scala and had been invited to be the prompter here. Understand, particularly at this time, artists, particularly Italian artists, didn't sing without a prompter. It was part of the tradition, and it was this sound underneath, even though they might not have needed the words, it was a pillow underneath.
I should interrupt just to clarify. The real reason in those days, a singer would come in maybe a week or 10 days before the opening and will have sung many other roles in the interim. Where here, in modern times, a rehearsal period is usually 3 or 4 weeks, so they have plenty of time to get the material, if it's a role they've done before, back in their head, or if it's something they're doing for the first time, they've had a chance to adequately rehearse. But prompters were essential in those days because the singers didn't have that kind of rehearsal period.
At any rate, Maestro Naldini was not allowed into the country. This sweet, darling little man was a communist. So there was no prompter. And Larry Calli, the director, and Nicola Vecino, the conductor, said, "Okay, Bliss, you're on." So I was considered to be the prompter. And from then on, Callis liked me as the prompter. She wanted me in her dressing room every night. I prompted her later in New York and in Philadelphia, in which she was doing performances of La Pirata. And it was very moving for me because on opening night, she had her bouquet, she was given her bouquet, and she swept down to the prompter's box and with a big bow gave me a rose, which was a very charming, lovely thing to do. Anyway, that was not my first contact with her in Traviata, because as a young man I happened to be in Europe and went to La Scala to see her performance of Traviata in the very famous production directed by Visconti and conducted by Giulini. This performance was probably the greatest influence in my life of anything I've ever done. I was a budding director in my mind, but this performance really set my course. And the way we are doing the production right now, that gets us up to 2012, is almost an homage to Visconti. We decided to do it in the same period. He updated the period to 1870-75. And one of the reasons he did that, because he had beautiful, slim collars, and he thought that this was the most flattering costume for her, this period. Fortunately, we have an incredibly beautiful, slim Violetta here, and the costumes are absolutely ideal for her. Anyway, this period makes perfect sense. It was still the age of the courtesan in Paris. I say courtesan, don't forget. A lot of people try to turn this opera into an opera about prostitutes and whores. It is not. It's about courtesans who were most sophisticated hostesses. They would service the man who was paying as hostess, as a companion in bed, or whatever. And the man most often had a wife tucked away some other place. And these were intelligent, sophisticated women who were capable of servicing the master of the house. So this production, when Alan and I were first asked to do it, it was done just 2 years ago for the Miami Opera, of Florida Grand Opera they call it. And so we decided on this period, did a lot of research, a lot of physical research into it. The way we work, we do that, digest that, and the next thing that comes is what we call the ground plan. You know, every opera has a certain number of doors, entrances, levels, important places for important action, and that's our next process. And that goes on for a long time until we find what is appropriate for the action, and to make sure that the important musical values are respected. First of all, I consider myself a musician who happens to be a stage director. So that makes it hopefully easy for the maestro, hopefully. There is something today, it's called the age of the stage director. So I do respect that to a certain degree, because in the rehearsal room, we each have a podium, and I insist that my podium be 1 inch higher than the maestro's.
This is not true. Well, maybe psychologically. Alan, as the designer, you and Bliss have worked together for nearly 50 years. You've done, I don't know, do the arithmetic, people.
Actually, the first production was precisely 48 years ago in Houston, Texas, and it was when the Houston Opera was a baby company, and it was Don Giovanni with Giorgio Tozzi and a number of other wonderful artists who some of us remember.
Well, you have obviously over that many years established a relationship. You've worked with other directors, and Bliss has worked with other designers, but there is obviously a telepathy, an intuitive understanding that goes into it, but you fight all the time in the process. So it's not exactly like you see everything exactly the same way. So talk about the development of an idea and how
I wouldn't say we fight exactly. We disagree a lot about certain things, but mostly in detail. Not really about the basic idea of a production. For example, this production let me not even talk about this production first. We are both of the same mindset that the composer, whether alive or dead, is a partner. If we are doing an opera by Wagner or Verdi or Monteverdi, this is still a partner to be respected. We don't, this relates back to what Bliss was talking about, Régie Théâtre. We find it very difficult to go against the wishes of the music or the scenario. We don't believe in this. We find our own way to tell the story and make it understood to the audience. The way I often like to explain it is this. Me personally, if I go to an art gallery and see a painting, and if that painting has to have an explanation to the side of it of what I'm looking at, then the painting isn't doing its communicative job. And we feel the same way about the way we tell the story of an opera on the stage. No matter whether the setting is an abstract setting, or it's taken out of period, or it's true to absolutely the period of the composer and the librettist, we both believe in telling the story in a way that is understandable to an audience. And to ourselves, I don't like going to the opera and being confused by what I'm seeing. I don't like having to walk out and say, what was that all about? Why did I spend $120 a ticket? you know, or as we were speaking in rehearsal the other day, I really feel sorry for singers who get stuck in productions that they don't believe in, but there they are, they have to do it, you know, they've signed a contract. So in terms of this opera, I don't think we had very much argument. We both agreed that this wasn't necessarily only a tragedy about Violetta and her death. We all know she's going to die from even before we've heard it or seen it. Everybody knows that she's going to die at the end. This is an opera about hope. This is the hope that comes through love. And you could think of that as a spiritual or in a religious manner, but this is an opera where we have physically set the stage. Surround is about death. And within that, the hope that comes from her love, from this young man who wants to take care of her. You know, in the film, the Garbo film, it's very, very clear. Robert Taylor knows from the beginning that she's a dying woman. And he just wants to take care of her for the rest of her life. And what happens is she then begins to feel the hope that she may survive. She may live because of his love. And that's really the tragedy, that you, just because of your love for your spouse or your lover or what have you, you're not going to, you know, change fate. And you know, it's really about fate. So that is the point of departure that we took. And you'll see in the set, in Act 1, right away, you see a funeral monument for Violetta with her added, a very 19th century pose or attitude during the prologue. And that funerary monument remains on stage all the time, and basically she dies at the foot of it at the end. But in Act 2, when she and Alfredo have moved to the country, or they are living in the country, at her country place, you'll see that that funerary monument has sprung to life. Out of it is growing this huge wisteria vine that kind of becomes the garden, that they're this sheltering womb-like garden that they're in. And it is out of the tragedy, in my mind, it's out of the tragedy, comes this hope in the form of life and flowering like springtime, and then of course, it doesn't pan out. So that's a little, but we don't really fight anymore. And having done 48 years worth of productions, he just leaves me alone very much, and I leave him alone too.
I remember listening to my grandparents, and whenever they would bicker back and forth about anything, if my grandfather said something was black, my grandmother would say it was white. And when they were told by any family member, why are you always arguing? And they would look shocked. We're not arguing, we're having a discussion. James, you've done the role of Alfredo probably more than anything else in your rep, pretty much. You've done it a lot in a variety of different productions. Tell us a little bit about your experience coming to Dallas, doing this production for the first time, having just done it in Munich in a very different production. What do you bring as an artist to each production, and what do you have to discard every time you start out singing this role?
Well, yeah, I have done it many, many times. I have done a few productions, as Alan was saying, that I didn't care for, that are, to me, didn't really make sense at all. One many, many years ago in Italy, in Bologna, that took place in a swimming pool. I still don't understand what the idea was, and all of the performers before each show were in our dressing rooms kind of like, oh man, here we go, we got to do this thing again. And the audience booed every night, and so it was hard to get excited for it. So I love a more traditional, I forget the word Bliss used. A classic production that is pretty close to how the composer intended it and the librettist intended it, and the story, the novel. And, you know, so I'm not one for altering it too much. I like what they said about respecting, how it was intended to be played. And yeah, Alfredo is it's a great debut role that I've used it. It's a great vehicle as a debut for in major houses. I've done it at the Metropolitan and the Royal Opera and recently Munich, and because you can really make your mark. I mean, you really need to have an Alfredo that's you have to have, it has to be a believable chemistry. You have to believe that this young man gives her hope and gives her reason to live and to want to change her life. And from a vocal standpoint, you get to really sing quite a bit and really make a strong impression, but you don't quite have the weight of carrying the show like the soprano does. So it's been a great debut role for me, and I'm happy to be here in this great production and to work with these guys, with Bliss and Alan again. I worked with them many years ago in Miami. We did Lucia like 7 or 8 years ago. So it's nice to work together again. And as far as just you try to bring honesty to the score and to the character. It's he's a young, he's very passionate, but he also has an edge to him that, in the second act, in the second scene, he's bitter, and he's kind of, he stands up for what he thinks is right, and he's a bit irrational, but it's a great character. It's a great acting vehicle for me. You get to really show your acting chops.
It's really wonderful watching James in rehearsal, the scene where Violetta gives him the camellia and says to come back, and the reaction to that, and it dawns on him that she's saying, come home, come see me tomorrow, and he lights up like a puppy dog. He gets all excited. It's adorable and sweet and touching and impetuous and spontaneous, and I've never seen anyone play it with such an honesty. It's really refreshing. Laurent, you get to play sort of the villain of the piece, but you're not really. Tell us a little bit about what you think about Germont.
Well, I don't think, if you want. But it's good in Italian opera to be a baritone and not being necessarily the bad guy of the thing, which doesn't happen too often, actually. It's true that I was presented sometime with some productions where from the start it was said that, okay, so Giorgio Germont is really not a very nice person, but actually, and as Bliss was telling during the rehearsals, and which is pretty much what I think, is that you don't have to think one is bad or one is good. Actually, one can feel sorry for everyone in this piece. Well, I mean, we all as parents can put ourselves in the same situation, and seeing that our kid is dating a person with not maybe the best reputation around. And of course, even if we're not speaking of prostitute, the closest thing that we could think of now would be a highly prestigious call girl. I know that maybe more and still, I don't think it's something that any of us as parents would take very lightly. And so we do what we have to do with this thing. And it's actually, that's when what Marco said about feelings coming even ahead of the beauty of the music, that's exactly what, as a performer, I experience each time I sing this wonderful scene, which is maybe for me one of the best scenes in the whole opera, the confrontation between Violetta and her father. He comes in, he wants to stay 30 seconds, slap her, and then get away with his son. That's all he wants to do. And that's why, of course, if you have a kind of shallow view of it, you can think he's not a nice person. He sort of builds himself. It's like you can play the character many ways. First, you can think there are maybe one question that you have to think of first when entering the stage, and that you can play with, is either this man had been with courtesans, or is going with courtesans, or know what it's all about, or if he's coming from maybe a more uptight family where this is not, where this is not happening, because both are possible. And still, in my belief, I mean, I prefer to act him if I'm given the choice. I think of him as someone that has not been too much, in contact with that world. So you can imagine that he's coming into a ground that's not so easy for him. And so he maybe overdoes it. Like Madame Michela Valery, yes, he wants to scare her or something. And from the first answer of Violetta, he sees that it's not what he expects to find, And then there's this sort of confrontation of powers, and there's this transformation of the mutual understanding, actually, of both characters that comes in this scene, and which means that even if you try to make of Germont a villain, the force of the expression of the music of Verdi is so incredibly stronger than whatever you can put in it, that as much as I could try to play him as a villain, the music would say no. So it's a very and we were also making this reference to wonderful Lionel Barrymore in the Camille film. I mean, it's very hard, whatever you do, to escape from this painting that Verdi gives us of a quite understanding man in the whole that just does what he has to do. And it's also quite surprising when you think of Verdi having this maybe resent against the judgment of the population around for him living with La Streponi, You could have think that he would have made a much more, one-sided and ridiculous character of this father, even subconsciously. But he was also a man. He was also not a young man at the time. He wrote. He was in his 40s at the time, and 50s, almost 40s at the time he wrote Traviata, and maybe he would have been a young man with that kind of woman. He would have written a different kind of character, but at that time he had the experience of life, at least a mature man, and so I guess that we can play it in the 23rd century or play it in the caveman age. I mean, the story won't change much. It's about society. It's about living in society. It's about one's own pulsions and what a community has to bear with, to go through. I mean, so it's that's a very interesting thing, that whatever you come up with, or you come first with as a performer, the music leads you in the direction it has to lead you, and there's much.
Could I just say something on the same train of thought? Callas was always known as a great actress. Well, Callas always said, all you have to do is listen to the music. The music tells you everything. And she was one of the greatest musicians I've ever come across. And we are lucky here, I feel, we have tremendous actors with these three lovely people, but they are also tremendous musicians.
May I add a little thing there too about design? One of the things that I do, which at home drives Bliss totally crazy, is for the 6 or 7 months that I may be working on the designs of a production, I play at the start of the day, I play the opera, or at least part of the opera, just to get my blood flowing, because the music does everything and it guides my hand.
It's the inspiration, obviously.
It's a visceral thing.
Myrtò, tell us a bit about Violetta as a character, and what drew you to her. Why? I mean, for me, this is a role equivalent for an actor to play Hamlet. She has opportunity to display so much dimension, so many facets of her character, vocally, dramatically. The whole combination of qualities that she engenders is so compelling. When you first sang this or began studying the role, what appealed to you? What were the challenges and what were the things that you were the most concerned about?
First of all, it's wonderful to interpret this difficult role. And I mean, it's difficult because in the first act it's totally big, it's a party, and her first aria is a lot of about the emotions. It's very with a lot of coloratura. Second act is this confrontation with Germont, and this it's more heavy, even vocally. It's more dramatic. And in the third act, you have to keep, you have to be almost able to leave your voice, just like speaking, like not to singing sometimes, because she's going to die. So you have three palettes that you can use with your voice, and you have to discover, and in every production I discovered different things, I would say. And I was very lucky to do my first Traviata, to do it with Franco Zeffirelli in Rome. And I say that I was lucky because we worked a lot on the libretto, speaking, and just having the score and speaking about the personality of Violetta, because it's a complicated role, vocally, but also emotional, or has many different things. And she is so honest as a person. She is so generosità. She has a lot of many things, wonderful things to give.
Well, that's why everyone is in love with her.
Yeah.
And why all of us are in love with you.
Oh, thank you.
And you've also done this with David McVicker. It's interesting sidebar, David McVicker and Franco Zeffirelli both made their stage debuts in America here at the Dallas Opera.
Yeah.
Just thought I'd throw that in.
And yeah, I worked with with Franco and with David. It was a wonderful Traviata both, and I think also the Traviata that we have here is wonderful, because Bliss gave me also the opportunity to feel free and to express myself, and to discuss what is better, what to do, not to do. And it was really wonderful to work with him.
Well, this is why opera is a collaborative art form, and there is no definitive production. And that's why we as an audience come
Exactly.
back to see every time someone comes to do, it's their interpretation. But it changes, even though Myrtò brings qualities that are extraordinary. When she does it with James and with Laurent, it's different than if you did it with another tenor and another baritone, with another conductor and another stage director. And that spontaneity that comes with new ingredients, and it makes it always different.
Yes, of course. But always, personally, I always have some little things that I bring from this production, or from that, or from this maestro, from or personal things that I feel that somehow are mine, and I give my personal input. Yeah, exactly. So I keep these things, and I add other interesting and new things, something like this.
Marco, for you as a conductor, it must be very difficult, because you've analyzed the score, you've come in, you have very clear ideas of what you want to do musically, and then you face a cast who have their own ideas, and a stage director who has his own set of ideas. How does this whole process of collaboration work?
Well, that's probably the most fascinating part, I would say, in the sense that despite the fact that, one has been through many times the fact of facing in front of such a masterpiece, the fascinating and never-ending process is what this incredibly rich treasure of such a score becomes and evolves and changes each single time. And it does change each single time because, exactly, it's sort of almost an alchemic process. And this process of alchemy, if not chemistry, is because of what each single artist does add to the process, which is an ongoing process, processing theory in the becoming. And then, of course, sometimes this process is not without difficulties. I mean, the main one, normally, I'm speaking now as a conductor, is the fact of working sometimes with directors that they don't understand the music, or they don't seem even to feel the music. It's not, I mean, I don't put this into, you know, the sort of a first level discussion of, oh, when a director doesn't play the piano, like, I mean, in this case, of course, is a phenomenal thing that the director is a wonderful musician, as Bliss is, but as the fact of, I always talk about feelings in the sense of what one actually feels about the music. One doesn't have to be a musician as such to understand music. One feels the music mainly. Then we are musicians because it's our profession, but one feels the music. So when there are some even wonderful directors, but they don't seem to have that kind of sensibility. Now, from there onwards, you can have problems. Then, of course, you can accept to deal with those problems or not, and then therefore leave. But then, it's on the contrary, the fact of having and dealing with artists that they come from different cultures, different even approaches of the score, can bring each time something not only new, but that makes you think about a certain scene, for instance, of what Laurent, for instance, was saying about the character of Germont, which is, you know, one can see it one sided or not. One can see, but it's what is extraordinary, like in this case, is the fact that in fact these characters, and therefore these scores, they seem to have no end, and it's probably the definition of classics, if I may say. That is, a classic is in terms of a score of a literary masterpiece. It's one of those texts that you can always go back to it and always find something completely new, or that speaks to you as if it was the very first time. And if I would have to define what a classic is, it's probably this. At least it's my opinion.
Bliss, our last production this season was Peter Maxwell Davies' The Lighthouse, and the director, Kevin Moriarty, had never directed an opera before. And for him, the biggest challenge was, in the theater, you have total control over the casting. But in opera, you arrive and you have been given all of these ingredients and you've been told what you're supposed to bake, but they don't always necessarily, the souffle doesn't always rise, I suppose, if I'm going to take that analogy one step further. So how do you work with different artists to bring out what is the best that you can with them?
Well, I have to tell you, when I'm working with an artist that I don't know, I have the most awful stage fright, because
You mentioned that, yes.
I can write anything on a paper, I can study the music endlessly. TRAVIATA I've been doing for the last 30 years, someplace or other. And that moment of first meeting, you know, you have to somehow or other figure out what the chemistry is going to be. This time, it seemed to work almost immediately. I had one serious moment of panic, and that was Laurent's first day of rehearsal. We had not met before, and I felt terribly, terribly lonely because Marco had an orchestra rehearsal. So it's always nice when we begin together.
It's you and me.
And it's also, right. And we looked at each other, and we each managed not to have a black eye. And almost immediately, I mean, I live in France, he's a Frenchman, I sort of feel I understand the French, and he is absolutely the best of the French. He's charming, good humor. He studied in England, eh?
That's the reason.
May I ask a question of you, Jonathan? Because part of what's being discussed now, the chemistry of the artists who are all brought together, is your responsibility.
Yeah.
You're the one.
I love the fact that you asked the question. Actually, I thought that was splendid.
It's a little bit, for you, it's a little bit like a Chinese menu. I'll take one from column A, two from column B, three from, how do you do it?
Well, in this case, it was very simple. You start with the Violetta. And when, I mean, I was going to ask Myrtò about this, what does she do when she walks in and finds, a 5'3" tenor? And I will say, the chemistry, when she walked into the room and she saw James, she lit up like a Christmas tree. And the two of them started flirting outrageously in the music. They, just in the rehearsal, they'd never met, and the chemistry was palpable. It was exciting to see. But you're right, it's very difficult, and it was very interesting because Myrtò came and sang for me several years ago in Bologna, and she was prepared, as all sopranos would, to sing A Forse Lui in Sempre Libera, and I really didn't care about that, because for me, what really is the test of any great Violetta is the reading of the letter and the aria A Dia del Passato. And when she began Teneste le promessa, I started to weep, and I knew I'd found the Violetta. And it is truly a great privilege to watch this in the rehearsal room and see what she brings to this character. It is unbelievable. I've seen a lot of productions of TRAVIATA, and it never ceases to move me on some level. But that's after weeks of rehearsal and costumes and lighting and everything. In a rehearsal room at a first musical rehearsal, to bring me to tears, it's pretty astonishing. So you have a great treat in store for you, I'm convinced. We have time for some questions, and I know that you always want to know something about the singer. So before we go to the questions, I'm going to ask each of our panel to talk a little bit about how they came to discover that they had talent and wanted to pursue a life in music. So James, let's start with you. When did you first know that you wanted to be a singer? An opera singer at that?
Yeah, I get this question a lot. People always say, didn't you want to become a pop singer? Or, I started singing in high school. I was about 14, 15 years old. And at the time I was sort of typical, American guy. I played basketball and, ran track and baseball. And I come from an Italian family, so music was always, somewhat present, but I didn't really hone in on it until later. I had a teacher in high school that encouraged me to join one of the choirs. It was I think we had to as a sort of requirement. So I joined one of the choirs, kind of just thinking, a good way to meet girls or something, And one of the choir directors approached me one day and said, "You have a voice. I can when you're singing, when you're really contributing, I can tell you have a really interesting voice. Would you consider auditioning for some of the extracurricular choirs?" And at the time I thought, it doesn't really interest me, but okay, maybe. I decided to, for whatever reason, I decided to. And I remember I sang Billy Joel the longest time, in my audition, And I had just come from basketball practice, and I went in and sang the longest time. And so I got into these extracurricular choirs, and from there it just sort of snowballed, and I was encouraged to audition for one of the roles in the musical, and I was cast as Lieutenant Cable in South Pacific, and so, younger than springtime are you. And from there I just started listening more, and then as it sort of serendipitously happened, the Three Tenors became popular in the mid to late 90s. And suddenly I remember listening particularly to Pavarotti, and it just kind of clicked. And I was young, I was sort of a quasi-baritone at the time, but something just kind of clicked, and I thought, wow, I was amazed at the instrument and the power and the range and the expression. And So I just started listening to a lot of opera, and my teacher encouraged me, and then I decided to go to college to become, I thought maybe a choir director or something. And I had a voice teacher there who had himself been a operatic tenor. And I remember on my very first lesson, he said to me, he's like, you sound like a young Corelli. He's like, you could be a great tenor, you know? And he started encouraging me and more and more and more. And it kind of started from there. And when I was about 22, 23, I just started to find my voice and, you know, figure out, you know, because there's a lot to it. It takes a lot of time. And you also have to have the coraggioso, the courage to go up there and sing, you know, and to be a little bit, look at me, I can sing. You know, you have to have that quality. And so it just sort of happened from there. And then when I was 25, I started doing a lot of competitions and things, and I made my professional debut when I was 25, and I had done a number of young artist programs and things, but it was sort of a path. I mean, I'm very grateful to some of my teachers that I had that really, you know, encouraged me. I was young, I was a bit naive, and they recognized, you know, a degree of talent and kind of pushed me that way. And so I would have found that, I think eventually I would have found opera, because I feel like it's what I meant to do, but I was lucky when I was young that I had people that heard that, so that's more or less my story.
Marco, you told me the other day about when you were in the conservatory, you had a group of fellow students, all of whom have seemingly gone on to great success as conductors, although you all started out as instrumentalists.
Yes, as a matter of fact, my hometown is Genova, and it happened to be, and in those years when we were all children, to have actually be the city of several very successful conductors in the world. One is Fabio Luisi, it's now Metropolitan. The other one is Marco Armigliato, that is conducting in the USA since many years. And myself, we had all the same age, although with very different family and personal backgrounds, because both of them were excellent pianists. Whether I was a cellist, my main instrument was the cello, but I did pick up the cello because before I was singing as a child in church first, as many Italian boys do, of course, and that's how I started myself with music. And then I did an audition because the priest of the church said, I think you should do it. I was only interested in football at the time. That was the only thing that really did interest me deeply. And so I did this audition for the Teatro Comunale Carlo Felice, and I was like 7, 8. And the conductor of the opera, which was Tosca, was Patané.
Oh,
Giuseppe Patané. So he did the audition. Then I was playing Io adesso spirito rimano. Then I was to sing pop songs, etc. And he said, no, you should do it. And I was always, of course, singing by heart, because in church we had to learn, and it was very easy for me to learn by heart these Gregorian chants, and I was fascinated by that. So I went on learning like hundreds of them, like that. And so, but I sort of, since I don't come from a particularly musical family, it's a little bit like what you were saying, no? Mm-hmm. Like Italian families, very often, you know, they all more or less make music, but without being having let's say a proper musical culture training. So I did this audition, and then I remember Patané bringing me in the pit of the orchestra and explaining me these instruments. It was like in a fairy tale. It was, and I was really so fascinated by this man, by the fact that he was, you know, sort of moving his hands. He could. So I thought he was some kind of a magician. So I thought, oh, gee, this is something fantastic. Just with the hands, the fingers, and everyone sort of. So it's a real magician. I'd love to do that. And so therefore, after that production of Tosca, which was with Raina Kabaivanska, I remember, so I was really taken, and so I decided, I was asking my family if I could really study music, and I decided to play the cello, because in the third act of Tosca there is the famous cello solo after the shepherd scene. So I thought it was a phenomenal sound, and that's how I started to do. So then, from there onwards, it was just like a consequence of that. Out of that, then I studied composition, etc., and then I've done competitions, and then sort of more of a normal route towards what eventually did in. But that was the beginning. That was how.
Myrtò, you were born in Thessaloniki?
No.
Where?
Larissa.
Ah.
Larissa is a city near to Mountain Olympus.
Aha.
It's a city between Athens and Thessaloniki, so it's in the middle.
And when did you first know that you wanted to be a singer?
I didn't know that I wanted to be a singer, but I was singing since I was a baby, and my mother was like, "Oh my God, this baby doesn't speak, but only doing like this," and she was very nervous because she was thinking maybe I have a neurological problem. Oh my God, should I ask the doctor why is not speaking, this baby? So, yeah, it was a little bit freaky for my parents, but at the end they understood that I have a talent, and they brought me to the choir of the child choir. I was 4 or 5 years old. And then I sang my first solo when I was 8, something like this. And then I started to study piano, and then after, harmony, the theory of music, and all this. My sister, she's also a violoncellist. Mm-hmm. And my parents also, they met each other in a choir. They loved each other, so the family was the family had a lot of music, always music, and we were doing always festa with music, a lot of music. My grandfather, that I didn't meet him because he died, but my father told me that he had a wonderful tenor voice, and he had a taverna because it was a very poor family, and but he was doing violino, small guitar, and he was doing these things. And then I studied piano, and then harmony and musicology, the university, and also to the conservatoire to study singing. But I really didn't know if I'm gonna do this profession, because it's not so easy to say from the beginning, yes, I have the voice, so I will do this. It's not like this, because it's not only about voice, it's many ingredients has to be there inside. All these things needs to, it's not easy. So at the end I said, yes, this is for me. I love the stage. I love to sing for the people. I love to express myself by my voice, and now I'm here to give to you.
Well, were that it were so easy, there are a lot of steps along the way. Alan, you're distinguished in one sense that you're probably the only American designer that designs exclusively for the opera, as opposed to going back and forth between theater and opera. How did you become so enamored? Because you started out, you should tell them about his first job was with Dallas Summer Musicals, so.
First job in Dallas, yes. But that wasn't my first job. I think I came out of my mother's womb with a paintbrush in my hand. My family was, there were a great many painters, not very successful, but a great many painters in the family. So from a very early age, I knew I wanted to be an artist of some sort. And I didn't know what, but my parents indulged me because my father had wanted to be an artist, but the Depression came along and he had to get serious and make a living. I went to Art Students League in New York, Brooklyn Museum classes for kids in the early days, and High School of Music and Art. And while I was at the High School of Music and Art, I saw my first Broadway show from backstage. It was wonderful. It was The Music Man, and just looking down from the fly floor where my friend's father was the sound engineer, it was just magic to watch Barbara Cook and Robert Preston and the scenery of Oliver Smith and the stagehands. I knew I wanted to be a theater designer after that, 13 years old. When time came to enter university, I chose Boston University because it was one of the few schools on the East Coast of the United States that had an undergraduate course in theater design. And in my freshman year in college at Boston University in the theater school, Sarah Caldwell was just starting her little company. Actually, Sarah Caldwell was the opera teacher. She was the head of the opera department in Boston. And I had a job working on a production of La Finta Giardiniera as an electrician backstage. And just fell in love with opera. And that was in my freshman year in college, and worked as many opera productions, extracurricular outside of school that I possibly could for 4 years, and graduated from school. And the year I graduated, had the good fortune to meet this guy. And I've been designing for him ever since. And sort of that's, I mean, it never was a question what I was going to do in my life.
And Bliss, you've touched on the fact that you began as a pianist and prompter and assistant stage manager and stage director. And how did you know? And when did you know? Oh, he also ran an opera company along the way too in Washington. So he's done everything pretty much.
Yeah. Well, I started piano at 3. And I turned into very early what is known as those awful people called a prodigy. And my whole childhood was totally involved with music. And I was from a small town up north New York. Biggest city was Montreal, close by. And the Met, of course, was Saturday afternoon. And how many people were influenced by just that, you know, by the time they're 6, 7, 8, 10 years old.
Parenthesis, the name of the town was Faust, New York. Now,
that's another story.
Now that sounds sort of...
If you have time later, I'll tell you the story about that. Anyway, I became enamored of singers. And we had music all the time. From Montreal, they played the old La Scala recordings that were made 1930, 1931. So Saturday afternoon always had opera on it, even when the Metropolitan season was not on. I went to college as a piano major, enamored with singers, and the first thing that happened to me in college was I met this crazy voice teacher and started to play for his singers. And it ended up, by the time I was freshman and sophomore, I was playing 10, 15 recitals for singers. And this is the guy that insisted that I learn the entire repertoire. I mean, I still know all of the German repertoire, the French repertoire for recitals. But also he had an opera company for young people who were already out of college in Massachusetts. And I went there, we did 10 operas a season. And we had to do everything. I was rehearsal pianist, I sang in the chorus, I worked backstage, made props, all of those things that we used to do in summer stock, except this was opera. And that first season, I met a stage director, Hans Busch, who was from the famous Busch family. And
not that Bush family, sorry.
B-U-S-C-H. Yeah, and he thought that I was extremely gifted as a coach, and I was, by this time, 18 years old. And he took me to the Met, and he wanted to give me an audition to be a coach pianist at the Met. And he turned me over to a wonderful man named Max Rudolph, whose position in the Met was Jonathan's position here. And we spent several days together, and he said, I think you've got a lot of talent, stay away from the Met. at your age, if you stay here, you'll get stuck, and God knows where you will go. So he said, go home and finish college. Well, the next summer at the opera company, the little opera company, I met a man named John Reich, who had been Max Reinhardt's assistant. And during those times, I was also doing opera scenes with him, and he felt that I had a talent to work with singers as a director. And so from there on, I started to work, and my first job out of college was Sarah Caldwell again in Boston. I don't know if she's still a name that is as known as it was several years ago.
Well, she is here because she had the distinction of being the first female director and conductor at the Dallas Opera. She did Mignon here in 1974.
Anyway, then I got my first job. No. I went in the Army for 2 years. 2 years in the Army, and I studied. I went to the opera every night in Paris. When I had to leave, I went to every night in Vienna. And it was an incredible experience. The Army was heaven to me, you know, because I was living in the opera house. The next year I got out of college, I had worked with Sarah Caldwell in Boston on the Rijksprogres of Stravinsky, and Stravinsky was there. And Stravinsky asked me to be in the very first year of Santa Fe Opera. There was an old director was hired, Leopold Sachse. He was about, really geriatric.
Older than you are now is what you're trying to say.
Yes. And so he was asked to leave, and John Crosby asked me to direct the Rijksprogres because I knew it better than anybody else. And that was actually my debut with Stravinsky, and all I can say is it was snowball. After that, it was a snowball.
Well, it's an impressive resume. Laurent, tell us how you got started.
Well, to put it shortly, I was lucky enough to have a wonderful music teacher when I was in high school. And that's pretty much the person to whom I owe what I am now.
Or blame.
Or blame, yeah, some people. So I was not much of a musician when I was a kid. I was very lazy with a piano teacher that did not care much for, and I was that kind of student that was the perfect material for the French schooling system, which meant that I got top marks not doing much, and that's what I was comfortable with, not really asking myself what I was going to be. But then this teacher sort of woke me up in a way. And I found myself, when I was about to enter college, the equivalent in France, oh God, I don't know what to do, I'm not a musician at all. And I remember talking with her and saying, you know, I mean, you just started now with the piano, you're not good enough with that. You don't conduct, you don't have anything to compose. You have a voice, you know, you could use it. Like, a voice. You mean like the fat people screaming out on the stage? I mean, that's all I knew about opera. I mean, that's what for me was the opera, because that's what we would get on TV most of the time. And I think part of the performers are responsible also for that, but that's another matter and discussion that can go for ages. Anyway, I had a very solid classic music culture, a lot of chamber, a lot of symphony, but at home there was no opera. And the only vocal music I would know about at the time was actually the American standard music. I mean, that's where all I know of English come from. And that's really where my first and maybe last musical love will still be. But then, anyway, I was quite disciplined. I respected that teacher, and I thought maybe if it's the only way. But at the same time, telling my parents I wanted to be a musician and hardly knowing to make the difference between a do and a sol would not really be very convincing. So it was not even convincing for me. I hardly believed that I could do something with that. So I decided to go on and studied mathematics and physics and graduated as a PhD in engineering and not knowing what I would do about that. But actually it makes me feel comfortable, and my parents too, I suppose. And then came the last year after, what am I going to do? Am I going to do like maybe a postgraduate kind of thing? Am I going to try music? And believe it or not, it's not really my love for music that made me choose that way. It was more that I was, in my university, I felt kind of alone. I did not relate much with people. I did not have much to share with those people in a way, in a strange way. And I thought, that's not right. So I decided that, okay, I will try to, for a couple of years, maybe make a living giving private mathematics and physics lessons. Parents love their kids to have the support because they're so worried about that. And so there's a good market in Paris for that. And I decided that I would try to find teachers and see what it would come out, what would come out of that. And it's really going, working on that then I discovered that I really loved singing. Then I further discovered that I loved theater, which I had no idea about that anyway. And then, I met a teacher who happened to be teaching at the Guildhall School in London, and from then on, it's the usual story. Either it works, either it doesn't, or and then here I am.
It definitely works. All right, we have time for a few questions, so let me turn the floor over to you. Someone needs to raise their hand. I can't manufacture the questions. Please, someone raise their hand. Yes, Ketty, thank you.
Myrtò, is your family still active in music? And is anybody else in your family also involved professionally in music?
My sister, she's a violoncellist player. My cousin is a contrabassist. I have another cousin, she's a fagottist. Another cousin
bassoon player.
Percussionist. And my husband as well is a pianist and composer. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say that
When
counts.
you start the company?
It's a factory.
It's a factory.
It's a factory.
Are there any other questions?
Just a comment. We're all very excited about your being here, and Jonathan has been talking nonstop. So I don't mean to tell you that our expectations are high, but we're very much looking forward to it. It's great to bring you back, James. It's wonderful to see you again, too. So, congratulations.
All right, well, I
there
will.
was someone here.
Yes, all the way in the back.
Mr. Valenti, where were you educated?
Where was I educated?
Yes.
I did my undergrad actually at West Virginia University, and then I went to the Academy of Vocal Arts in Philadelphia, along with some other Dallas Opera people, Stephen Costello and Brian Email, and we all went to school together, and we all actually had the same teacher. So.
And Latanya Moore and
Latanya
Takesha
Moore.
Kizar, Jesus
Latanya,
Garcia.
Yeah.
Yeah. AVA is a factory that turns out great singers. It's amazing. All right, well, we're going to take a brief break now and resume at 4:30 with Magic Flute.